Welcome back to the lesson. We're going to talk about the Renaissance now, which is definitely an area that will come up in your studies. So it began in the 1300s in Florence in Italy, and it took its time spreading across Europe and really got to England by the early 1500s. One of the things that categorizes the Renaissance is humanist attitudes. So those are things that focus on what man can achieve and the genius of man, these sorts of ideas. So there's the drive of discovery and understanding the world, and also the drive of individualism and expressing oneself. So one of the other things that the Renaissance has going for it is emulation of what they consider the classics, which are the Greeks and Romans. And so that tended to lead to studies of poetry, grammar, and ethics, and also rhetoric, which is the study of making speeches and giving debates. So during this time, of course, there's great influence on science, literature, and visual art. So let's take a look at some of the main players. Famous texts and authors of the Renaissance. So one of the very early people is Niccolo Machiavelli. We tend to use the term Machiavellian to describe someone who's manipulative and evil, but that's not really how Machiavelli saw himself. He was just thinking that he was being clever and practical. So in The Prince, he outlines the keys to being a successful ruler, such as it is better to be feared than it is to be loved. So it's not so much that it's immoral, it's just ignoring morals and talking more about strategy. So he wrote The Prince to impress basically the mafia of the ancient world in Rome, the Medici, who were the people who ruled Florence. And he suggested things to them like, if you want to have a war with your neighbor, don't start a fight with the neighbor. Get a conflict going between the neighbor and the person next door to them, so that while they're both weakened, you can sweep in and claim both of them. So it's that kind of thinking. It becomes a very interesting book though, and it's actually quite easy to read as a translation. Leonardo da Vinci, you'll no doubt have heard of. So here's who you think of as the archetypical Renaissance man of Italy. So he is what we refer to as a polymath, someone who can do anything. So he dreamed up things like helicopters, tanks, solar power, calculators. He contributed to diverse fields, anatomy, biology, literature, engineering, geology, everything you can think of. And that's really what was represented by the notion of the Renaissance. You can do everything, you can contribute to everything, and you can learn and know everything too. Probably his two most famous works that you would know him by are the Mona Lisa, which we saw earlier, and the Last Supper. And then we get a little bit later on in the piece and we're back in England, and the most famous of our Renaissance scholars would be William Shakespeare. So what was special about Shakespeare, aside from his enormous popularity, was that he broke conventions by using prose or everyday speech rather than just writing all of his plays in sort of poetry or verse. He extended the use of soliloquy so that he was exploring characters' inner motivations and conflict. So he took the soliloquy and he kind of turned it into a voiceover so that you could understand what was going on in someone's head. It was also quite sophisticated writing as well. So in things such as King Lear, he's exploring the humanist themes of love, ambition, revenge, and also the meaning of life. So you can see that literature is really evolving over time and it's picking up more complexity as it goes. Another Renaissance man you may have to study is John Donne. He's what we refer to as a metaphysical poet. And he tended to write sonnets about subjects like religion, spirituality, love, suffering, and the soul. So, as you can probably tell from that list, metaphysical means beyond the physical. So it's anything to do with abstract notions and thoughts and kind of that sort of exploration with the mind. Generally, for modern day viewers, Donne represents religious individualism. He believed that you shouldn't just listen to the church, but you should think about what spirituality and religion means to you. And he also reflects a growing cynicism about Renaissance society. So some of his poems deal with pompous courtiers, corruption in the court, that sort of thing. Another Renaissance man you might like to know is Sir Francis Bacon. So he was an English philosopher, statesman, and he actually established the scientific method of investigation, where you have to start off with a hypothesis and then see if it can be proven. The thing that you'll be interested in is the fact that he is the creator of the English essay, as far as we know. So if you're thinking about someone to blame for your assignment, you can think of Francis Bacon. But one of the other things this shows us is that not only are we picking up Aristotle's notion of criticism, of literary endeavour, we are now writing essays about the subject. So it's all getting a little bit more complex. So what do you do if your teacher wants you to write in Renaissance style? Well, first of all, it's pretty hard, so it's a pretty mean assignment. Having said that, it is quite common if you're studying Shakespeare in year 10 and 11 for your teacher to ask you to try and write a sonnet, or to even try and write a soliloquy to fit in with what you're doing. So, the thing to keep in mind is that most Renaissance literary figures are going to be writing in verse. That is, it's going to sound poetic, it might even rhyme. And it's going to have an iambic pentameter rhythm. So that's 10 beats to the bar, or 5 feet. So you have a soft syllable and a strong syllable connected together, and you have 5 of them in a row to make 10 syllables. So it sounds like ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. And you'll notice that when you read any Shakespeare aloud. One of the other things to keep in mind is wit and wordplay. The language often has double meanings. And there might also be archaic words like thou, dust, air, which have fallen out of common use, but are quite easy to look up on the internet. So if you want to know more about the Renaissance, what do you read? Well, I would recommend having a look at Oedipus Rex. It's short and also gives you an insight into Greek culture, and we know that it's really influential on modern works. Metamorphoses by Ovid, again, not that hard to read. You can read each little story as it comes, so just one poem at a time, and it's very, very influential. So that's your Roman. The Song of Roland will give you an insight into the ideas of knights and castles and King Arthur type stuff. Canterbury Tales, it's very funny for a start, so that's a good idea. And it's also short stories within a story, so you can read them as you want to go at pace. The Prince, again, nice and thin. Also interesting in terms of non-fiction, because it is more like a non-fiction piece. Death Be Not Proud is probably the easiest of John Dunn's sonnets to understand. A Valediction Forbidding Mourning is a little bit more complicated, but it does go into metaphysical conceits, which is a technique you might need to know about for later school. And finally, we have a sonnet from Shakespeare, My Mistress' Eye is Nothing Like the Sun. So I've picked this one because it's quite a funny sonnet. Basically, in sonnets, normally the man will be writing to the woman and talking about how beautiful her eyes and her hair and her lips are. But Shakespeare's actually writing and saying, you know what, my mistress isn't that pretty, but I do love her. So it's a very different take on the whole thing.